you for joining us today. My name is Rudaina Al-Balbaki, and I will serve as the moderator of this timely panel discussion on the US-Iran escalating tension, as tensions between these two powers are at their highest point in years. So since the US unilateral withdrawal from the nuclear deal with Iran, and since its president embarked on a containment of Iran with maximum pressure strategy, putting Iran under increased economic, political, and diplomatic pressure, we have seen a pattern of what Rami has called in his recent Al Jazeera interview tit-for-tat actions between the US, Iran, Israel, and various Iran proxies and armed militias across the region. But since December 2019, we have been witnessing a severe increase of the level of the targets that has been hit or attacked, namely the US embassy attack in Iraq and the killing of Soleimani. Many observers believe that if we keep aside a big part of the political discourse of the two parties, of course, who are catering for their domestic audiences, discourse on the ending of malign US presence in West Asia or on Iran's malign activities across our region, both sides are actually calling for de-escalation. So if neither side wants a fight, does this eliminate the danger of having one? We are now over, I think, with the question of if the killing of Soleimani is going to lead to a war, but I think it has established some new red lines and deterrence margin. Is there a real window for diplomacy at this point? So who would be the mediators in the world who can step in and work on a negotiated solution or common ground? And finally, and maybe more importantly, how will all of this affect the protests in Lebanon, Iran, and Iraq? Now, moving along to our session today, we will have, let me explain to you what to expect. So we will have a first round of 20 minutes, 15 to 20 minutes per speakers, where panelists will give their initial remarks. And in round two, I'll be asking each of the two panelists to answer one specific question for 5 to 10 minutes. And later on, we will open the floor for the questions of the audience. So please welcome Rami Khouri, who will be providing us with a historical context in order to understand how we got here in the first place. Later on, Rami will be speaking about possible scenarios looking ahead. Rami Khouri is, of course, an internationally syndicated political columnist and book author, a professor of journalism and journalist in residence at AUB, and a non-resident senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School. He was the first director of IFI, and he is now a senior fellow at the Institute. He was the executive editor of the Beirut-based Daily Star newspaper, the editor-in-chief of the Jordan Times, and was awarded the Pax Christi International Peace Prize for 2006. Rami teaches or lectures annually at AUB and Northeastern University, and he has been a fellow and visiting scholar at a lot of universities, but I will only name Harvard, Princeton, the Fletcher School at Tufts, and Stanford University. Ali Ahmad is the director of the Energy Policy and Security Program at the Issam Fares Institute. His research and teaching focuses on nuclear security and energy in the Middle East. Prior to joining AUB, and with a PhD in nuclear physics, Ali was a research fellow at Princeton University's program on science and global security, where he worked on informing nuclear diplomacy with Iran during the critical period between 2013 and 2015. So, Rami, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rudaina, and the International Arab Affairs Program at IFI for arranging this, and I'm honored to be with my friend and colleague Ali, and happy to and honored that you're all here. I see we have some real international affairs scholars in this room, so I better be careful with what I say, but I will try to give you some background and maybe provoke some discussion. I'll talk a little bit about how we got here, where we are, and what are the possible things that are going to come out of this current situation. And then Ali will focus much more on the nuclear dimensions, energy and nuclear dimensions of it. So the first thing I would say in terms of the history is that the assassination of Qasim Soleimani and Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis the other day was the high watermark that has brought tensions to a head, and then the Iranians responded with 22 missile strikes at air bases in Iraq where Americans were present. But this is really the latest and slightly more dramatic than normal series of acts in a long-running contestation that's been going on for decades in our lifetime. But I think we have to see this in the context of a much wider and much older, call it confrontation. And this is really about four big questions, and I'll mention some details, but the four big questions I believe at stake here, and these help us understand how people are behaving, especially the Iranians. Who defines the culture and the policies of sovereign states in the Middle East? Do they define their own policies, or are they subject to permission from other countries, whether it's big countries abroad like Russia or the United States or England or France, or small countries nearby like Israel and other countries? Second question is, who gets to enjoy actual genuine sovereign power? Sovereign power meaning a country that is independent but actually can run its own policies. Or do you have to submit to the dictates of other people? The third related question, these are all related, the third one is, what are the limits of foreign intervention? Political, sanctions, military, economic, whatever. Are there any limits? The way the Middle East is going today, if you look at Libya today, it's the latest example, Iran, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon to some extent, Palestine. Foreign countries, regional Middle East countries like Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Egypt, a little bit in Libya, different countries, Israel, Turkey, they all come in with their armies, with their armaments, with their funding, with their training, with their red lines. Some of them actually occupy Arab land, set up shop. So where are the limits? Are there any limits? There seems to be a huge expansion in the last 10 years, especially since the war in Syria, huge expansion in the ability of any country, regional or global, to come into any Arab country and do anything it wants. And this is part of what we're seeing here. And fourth question is, what are really the deeper sources of instability and insecurity across the Arab region today? Are they domestic? Are they economic? Are they political? Are they foreign intervention, foreign colonialism? What are the real sources of the instability that we're seeing? So with those big questions in mind, I think we need to look at Iran and the US today as the latest episode of a confrontation that really we should trace back to 1953, the overthrow of the Mossadegh government, and the reactions in Iran to that, and the grievances, the resentments that have pertained ever since. But I would even say go back to the constitutional crisis of 1906, when you had the British and the Russians bombing Iran. And essentially, it was in that period, across the whole Middle East, actually started with Napoleon in 1798, but really it was around the turn of the early 20th century, when the British, the French, the Russians, others were playing, manipulating, bombing, attacking, occupying, drawing lines, creating the modern Arab state system in the Middle East. And I think you need to go back to that constitutional crisis of Iran. But if we take it in the most recent period, the advent of the Islamic Revolution in Iran, 79, the hostage crisis, the Iran-Iraq War of 1980, in the 1980s, when the US and others in the West actively supported Iraq against Iran. And then the expansion of Islamist movements across the region, the birth and growth of Hezbollah and Hamas in the early 1980s in Lebanon and Palestine, the big expansion of mainstream Muslim Brotherhood type Islamist movements throughout the 70s and 80s, some of which were inspired by Iran, most of which had their own dynamics. But all of these things happened together in a period of around 20 years, and started to create the two different camps that we see actively confronting each other today across the region. And going back to my early questions, that who really has the ability to define themselves? If you're a sovereign country, or if you're just a political movement or a social group, who has the power to define themselves? And what we've seen, broadly speaking, going back to the early 80s, those of you old enough in this room to remember the 80s, it was Alexander Haig and Ronald Reagan who first tried to create an Arab-American-Israeli alliance against Iran to contain Iran. They didn't do a very good job, and Trump has tried it. He hasn't done a very good job either. But this seems to be a recurring occupational hazard of Western leaders who try to put together alliances of Arabs, Israelis, and Western powers to contain Iran. And broadly, this is expanded today, where you get Arab countries like the Emirates and Bahrain's not totally sovereign. It's with the Saudis having coming in militarily to put down their rebellion, so they're very close to the Saudis now. But the powers of the UAE and the Saudi Arabia, Egypt a little bit. Egypt again has sort of mixed sovereignty with its massive dependence on money from the Gulf. So we have these issues of real sovereignty that we have to address across the region. But you've got these Arab countries now that, with Israel, have actively stoked the anti-Iranian sentiment. Whether it's legitimate or not is up to history to decide. I think they've exaggerated the threat that Iran poses, but this is the reality, that we have Arab countries with Israel actively pushing the Americans in particular to contain Iran, to push back Iran, to whatever, make Iran have more moderate policies, different words that they use. So, and that's what really brought us up to this situation. The Obama administration worked to create the nuclear and sanctions agreement, the JCPOA, in 2015. The P5, the 5 Security Council members plus one, worked together. So it wasn't just the Western world. You had the Russians and the Chinese and the UN Security Council. They all agreed, and the Iran agreement on nuclear and sanctions issues was a really historic breakthrough, which was highly unusual historically, because it showed a serious ability of major powers to negotiate with Iran rather than to threaten it, sanction it, bomb it, occupy it, or do any other things to undermine it. So this was an incredibly important moment. And then, of course, Trump unilaterally withdrew from it, and in 2018. And then in 2019, last year, we saw an escalating series of events with the Americans and the Iranians both going back and forth at each other, making threats, making noises, taking measures. And then you started to get, the Americans accuse Iran of having carried out 90 attacks, 90 attacks against Iran after May 2019. And most of these attacks were done, the US claims, by what they call surrogate forces. I don't like the word proxy forces or surrogate forces. I don't particularly like that word, but groups that are very close to Iran or controlled by Iran or created by Iran. So and then this escalated in the last couple of months, where you had the Iranians shot down an American drone, and then the Iranians, or somebody close to them, probably with some group of people that probably had a link to Iran, attacked some tankers, oil pipelines in Saudi Arabia, the Abqaiq oil facility. There was some serious escalation that took place. And then the United States pushed back and recently attacked targets in Iran, and then the embassy protests in the U.S. Embassy, and then finally the assassination of Soleimani and al-Muhandis. So this whole line of historical and current events and attitudes, political attitudes, it really has to be seen as one continuum. And what we have today is a situation where we had last night the American President Trump making this quite extraordinary speech, which was really something that psychiatrists are going to have to analyze rather than political analysts. It was really quite a performance, bizarre, I think, in many ways, and the American press themselves are saying this. But he made a speech in which he basically said, oh, well, okay, you know, we hit them and they backed down and now things are going to be okay. And I think that's a completely wrong analysis. It completely misunderstands the Iranian mindset. And I think one of the reasons why successive American presidents have to keep coming to the region and keep trying to organize Arabs and Israelis to create these big coalitions to push back Iran and failing every time is because they totally misread the mindset of the Iranians. I'm not saying that the Iranians are good or great political leaders. I have many criticisms of Iran. I wouldn't want to live in that kind of political system. They have many things that they can and should be criticized for. But the Western powers, and most of the Arabs and the Israelis, I think, regularly misread how the Iranians, why and how the Iranians behave, their defiance, their all the different things they do in their military preparations. And it's because they don't understand the central ethos of what is called the resistance culture. And this is a very controversial thing, the resistance culture, but it is the key to understanding why and how the Iranians behave. And the Iranians and people like Hezbollah and Hamas and other groups and many individuals and many other political groups, part of this resistance culture, which again, we can criticize very seriously and earnestly and legitimately. It has many weaknesses. Not many people are coming to live under resistance culture regimes. They tend to be autocratic, top-heavy. Human rights are often not well defined, but they have many problems. But they do drive the way that the Iranians behave. And I think if the people who are engaging with Iran don't understand this, then they're going to keep repeating these mistakes. And so what we had happen in the last week with the embassy process against the embassy, the American embassy in Baghdad, and then the American attack against Soleimani, and then the Iranian missiles at these two sites in northern and western Iraq. What we had was just the latest example, I think, of this process of people provoking each other and then people fighting back and not really solving anything, nor opening up any new diplomatic space. I think the nature of the Iranian attacks was really quite important, that they sent off, it was either 22 or 25 missiles against these two locations, and clearly, deliberately did not want to kill any Americans. And they have the precision capabilities in their missile facilities. As we saw in the attack on the Abqaiq oil facility last September, they have the capabilities to precisely send a missile somewhere, and that's what they did. And of course, they also told the Iraqis, so the Americans got the troops out of the way. So their aim was not to kill Americans. Their aim was, I think, to send a message that we have these capabilities and we're prepared to use them if we need to, but the Iranians are not suicidal. They don't want to get into an open warfare with the United States because the United States would obliterate them, especially under leadership as we have in the White House today. So their aim was to make a limited attack, send a message, show their capabilities, claim that it was a proportionate response, which it wasn't proportionate in its impact, but it was proportionate in its political significance. It sent the message, and the longer-term aim of the Iranians, I believe, is to push back the American military presence in the region, which they're not going to be very successful at doing. The Americans will get out of a few places where they're easy targets in Syria and Iraq, but I don't think the Americans are going to leave the region, so the Iranians aren't going to get very far at that. But they might possibly be able to push the Americans just enough so that both sides one day can get back into a political negotiation to resolve those core issues which remain at the heart of their contestation. The problem that the Iranians have is that their resistance culture, and Soleimani is a representative of this, is admired by many people but hated by many other people, in the Arab world in particular. And we've seen articles and people talking about this recently in Syria and Iraq and parts of Lebanon and other places. Many Arabs don't want anything to do with this kind of culture. And many of the protesters who were protesting in Arab countries were beaten up, especially in Iraq and other places, by security forces that were in part trained by Soleimani's people. So Soleimani and his culture and his legacy have a very mixed dimensions, but they do represent what is the guiding principle of Iran's policy, which is to develop and maintain and strengthen a network of allies and strategic partners like Hezbollah, like Hamas, like the Ansarullah, the Houthis in Yemen, and the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq and others, to have a group of people around the region that they can work with to help defend Iran if it is threatened. And their policy is a little bit like the Israelis. The Israelis have a policy of never fight a war in Israel. Always fight your wars in Syria or in Lebanon or in Egypt or in Jordan or somewhere. And the Iranians are a bit similar like this. They don't want to have a war fought in Iran. They want to fight their enemies in other countries, mostly the Arab countries for the moment. So the long-term plan of the Iranians, the long-term aim, let's say, is to just try to protect their country from these constant foreign threats and invasions and now sanctions that they feel are not always legitimate, but at the same time to remain open to engaging with the international community according to the basis of international law. And that's one reason, for instance, why they agreed to the 2015 agreement, and they stuck to it, and still today, as Ali will tell us, as they're doing all kinds of things, they're maintaining the inspections by the International Atomic Energy Agency. And the complexities, which I don't have time to get into, but maybe later, the complexities of the different actors is really something astounding today. To look at the different actors in Syria and Iraq, in Lebanon and Yemen, and the different groups, some with the governments, with their own governments. Say in Iraq, you have some groups with the government. Some groups in Iraq have said they're going to keep attacking Americans. Other groups said, no, that we're going to stop. This is a very fluid situation, and nobody can really make any serious prediction on this. But the only thing we can say is that this contest is going to continue in different forms for many years until reasonable leaderships in both countries are able to sit down and negotiate a resolution which has to include the Arab Gulf states and Israel and others to end this century-long ideological confrontation and finally allow all the countries of the region to live in genuine sovereignty and real peace and security and self-determination without constant foreign military intervention. Thank you.
Thank you, Rami, for your initial remarks. So, Ali, according to Rami, the problem is that Western and Arab powers and Israel misread the Iranian mindset. How does Iran's nuclear program fare in the current tension? And do you agree with Rami?
Thank you, Rodina. First, I would like to say that it's a great honor to share the panel with Rami, who is not only, I think, is one of the most distinguished analysts of the region, but also a great support and mentor to many people, including myself. So I think since Rami has given this important historical context, perhaps it would be also useful to offer a parallel context relating to the nuclear dimension and how it relates to the current conflict, building on your question, Rodina. I think from Iran's perspective, the importance or the motivation of the nuclear program is that it reflects heavily on the issue of pride and dignity of the Iranian nation. I think this rhetoric internally has a wide acceptance or wide appeal across the political spectrum in the country. And I think, although there are differences over perhaps the political approaches that should be followed within Iran, but there is a widespread agreement on the importance of the program for the country. Now, regardless if the nuclear program actually makes sense from an energy or economics perspective, which I think is an important factor, but perhaps not relevant to our discussion today, we should not forget that Iran is a signatory of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And according to Article 4 of the treaty, Iran has an inalienable right to research, develop, and use nuclear energy in a peaceful way. And I think that's why whenever the US presses Iran, or particularly, or the West presses Iran to give up its nuclear program, Iran translates that into a sign of disrespect and act in a way that becomes more aggressive within the nuclear program itself. Now, I think on the parallel side or on the opposite side, from the US perspective, there is also some degree of consensus on the controversial aspect of Iran's nuclear program. Both Democrats and Republicans perceive Iran's nuclear program as potentially problematic because it offers Iran, or they perceive that it offers Iran pathways to develop nuclear weapons. Now, and Rami referred to the 2015 agreement and many of its benefits. The main two benefits of the 2015 agreement is one, freezing these pathways, at least for 15 years. And the hope was to allow for time for confidence-building measures and building trust with Iran. And the second, on top of that, and the second component is to allow also for further inspection and verification measures. And in my opinion, the second component is much more important because the second component is indefinite. Now, clearly, we can talk about Iran's nuclear program from a technical perspective, but I think in the current moment, this is not perhaps fruitful because Iran's nuclear program is highly politicized. It's the technicalities of it follows the political. So the way Iran is treated on its nuclear file is outside the international law. Essentially, there are countries with similar capabilities to Iran. There are countries even that have more nuclear capabilities to Iran, non-weapon nuclear countries, and these countries are not demanded or are not treated in the same way. Now, if we examine further the role of the nuclear program in the current conflict, which I think this is your question. In fact, before the assassination of General Soleimani, and I think Rami also mentioned that, the US policy towards Iran was described as maximum pressure policy. And this maximum pressure translated into imposing more sanctions on Iran, particularly depriving it from its major revenue through blocking its oil exports. And in response to that, Iran adopted the maximum patience or maximum resistance policy, which in the beginning aimed to absorb this pressure and work with other partners in the nuclear deal to bypass the US sanctions. There has been some challenges, especially on the European side. If you talk to the Iranians, They have a lot to say about how Europe has failed them. But if in that dynamics, in that context of maximum pressure versus maximum resistance, the role of the nuclear program in Iran was very unique. The nuclear program offered Iran an elastic way or a measured way to escalate. And that's very important to understand in the current dynamics. The irony right now is that if Iran reverse its commitments of the nuclear agreement, actually it's a sign of de-escalation. I know that this is counterintuitive, but let me elaborate a bit more. If Iran decides to reverse its commitments on the nuclear deal, the first feature of that is that this is a completely reversible process. And this reversibility emerges from the fact that there's a time delay between saying something and acting on it. So Iran, for example, can say, okay, I no longer respect the 4% enrichment level, but they don't have to do it the next day. They can do it after a week, after months. And the second, I think the second aspect of it is that there is also a lot of other options and the gradual options. So here, I think this is a very sensitive issue. I don't want to be misunderstood. I'm not saying that we should take Iran's reversal on its commitments lightly, but if I'm given the option between a war and that, I think I would go for an option that gives me or buy us a bit more time. Now, the final part of my initial remarks is on the nature of Iran's commitments regarding the nuclear deal and regarding the current conflict. Again, also before the killing of General Soleimani, Iran made similar threats of withdrawing from the nuclear deal. But recently, because of the current developments since the assassination, we have heard Iranian officials bringing up the nuclear program again as an escalatory or escalation card. However, if we look deeper at their statements, there's something very interesting. This aspect is that the nuclear program or the reversal that they are threatening to do is not different from previous threats. And this gives a very measured signal from Iran's perspective that they are still have some commitments towards the nuclear deal. Now, I think there was a statement issued by Iran a few days ago, and I think I have a copy of that statement. Let me just give you two examples. The first sentence, Iran will continue its nuclear enrichment with no limitations and based on its technical needs. For me, the interesting part is the part on technical needs. As you can imagine, is a very vague term. It can mean very, very, very different things. However, if you go back to Iran's previous negotiations and deals, this term has actually been mentioned in these negotiations, and it always carried an implicit positive referral to Iran's peaceful intentions. The second example, which I think is more important, in the statement, Iran reinstates its commitments to cooperate with the International Atomic Energy Agency. And this is a very important statement as well, because in the context of weaponizing the nuclear program, the ability to inspect and verify and cooperate with the International Atomic Energy Agency is paramount. And the fact that Iran is committed to continue to allow international inspectors to access Iranian facilities clearly is a sign in the right direction. Now, I think to summarize, I still believe that the nuclear deal is alive, it's not dead. I think Iran still respects important components of the nuclear deal. However, the deal is in also very critical stage. Iran, I think for Iran, they are still interested in getting sympathetic response from the Europeans, from the international community, but here we have one caveat. And this caveat is if we go to the next level of confrontation. I think if we go to the next level of confrontation, I don't think the Iranians would care much about what Europe would think or the international community would think if they acted on their nuclear threats in parallel to what we have witnessed in the North Korea example. So personally, I've been following or working on Iran's nuclear program for the last 5-6 years. Personally, I wasn't convinced that Iran wanted nuclear weapons. But frankly, after what we're witnessing right now and after all the threats that Iran has received, randomly enough, is the threat on the heritage, attacking the heritage and historical site, for me, is a very, very important threat. And I think a lot of people took it lightly. And if you talk to the Iranians and if you understand the Iranian mentality, as Rami mentioned, Iranians think very highly of their civilization and their heritage and their history. And for them, I would not be surprised if that has created a new sense of insecurity. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali, for your initial introduction. Talking about the next level of confrontation, Rami, looking ahead, what are the possible scenarios?
I think with the Iranians, especially, not with the Americans, because Trump and the band of very peculiar people around him in the White House represents a level of uncertainty, bizarre and unpredictable behavior that we've never really seen from the White House. It's real, and this is something that American commentators are pointing out every day. So, but from the Iranian side, I think the Iranians are very predictable. They do what they say, and they tell you what they're going to do most of the time. And they have developed what they see as a self-defense system that is based on two essential factors. Three essential factors. One is a serious missile capability, which they've shared with many of their strategic partners around the region to some extent. Some of their missiles can go up to 2,000 kilometers, and they see these as defensive weapons. The second part is the network of strategic partners that they've developed, like Hezbollah, Hamas, and the mobilization forces in Syria and Iraq, and the Syrian government, and other very close allies who they can work with. And the third one is this really extensive and quite sophisticated network of capabilities in asymmetrical warfare. Midget submarines, drones that can be turned into missiles. They don't carry missiles, but they become missiles. They have speedboats, small speedboats that they use in the Gulf and in other places. A very sophisticated cyber attack capability, which they've used extensively, and apparently they just used it, or they're accused, somebody used it, and they're being accused of attacking an agency of the US government 2 days ago, some kind of depository mortgage, something or other. And things like surveillance drones, underwater mines. So they've got a whole range of technical weaponry and military equipment that they use. And a lot of this they put in the hands of their strategic allies, and therefore a critical element of Iran's actions and the way it responds to the threats that it seems, feels that it's getting, the threats and the actual attacks, is to have its allies do a lot of these things. So if a missile hits an American facility in Iraq, or if an American or somebody else is assassinated somewhere, they say, oh, we have no idea who did it, and they're accused of being behind it. Like the attacks in Saudi Arabia, we still have no certification of who actually attacked the Ibqaiq facilities. Now, the Iranians are accused, and I suspect they're involved in it, but there's no definite verification, and this is part of their strategy, which is deniability and flexibility. They can use different combinations of these mechanisms. They're not equipped to carry out conventional war. The sanctions on them have crippled them technologically, but they are very able to develop their own technology, as we see with the nuclear industry. So what I would see, and Iran has used these tactics and will continue to use them. So that's what that I would say. And they respond in a way that's commensurate with the perceived threat or the action taken against them. So I think we're going to see more responses to the assassination of Soleimani and the others. We don't know where it's going to be. We don't know who's going to carry it out, and we don't know the exact relationship to Iran in these acts that will come. But I'm prepared to bet 2 falafel sandwiches with hot sauce that this will happen. And I think we should expect it because this is what the Iranians tend to do. They've done it before, and it will continue to happen.
Before I ask the second question to Ali, I'd like to add a question. Iran exerts influence over capitals in the Arab region, and these capitals are now witnessing protests. So some observers have been saying that Iran, as you have highlighted previously, have a lot of strategic elements to play, but hasn't this order established by Iran in the region been socio-economically challenged lately by the protests we have been seeing, maybe in Iraq much more than in Lebanon, but to a certain extent in Lebanon and the limited demonstrations we've been seeing in Iran? Do you think that Iran thinks of itself as a power that needs to respond socio-economically to the crises of the populations of these countries?
No, I don't think it does, and I don't think it has the capabilities. Iran's economy is shredded. They've not been allowed to sell oil. They sell about 5% of what they used to sell. They're sanctioned. They can't trade. They're trying to set up an alternative global financial transaction system with the Europeans and the Russians and the Turks and the Chinese, and others maybe might join. But this hasn't happened yet, and it might only be used for medicine and stuff like that. So they have no capabilities. They can't take care of their own people very well. Iran's hanging in there. They're a very powerful, durable, proud, and able country, but they are economically strangled. And mainly because of the U.S. pressures, and other Western countries have joined to a certain extent, not fully. So they can't do that. The irony is that Iran was able to develop a network of strategic allies in Arab countries, because the Arab countries were so badly run, economically mismanaged, environmentally ravaged, politically neutered by powers around the region and overseas. So you had a bunch of Arab countries that were almost wrecks. They were really in deep trouble with internal problems, as we see with these amazing demonstrations over the last 9 years, nonstop. The demonstrations go back to the 1980s, actually, but the big ones blew up in 2010 to 11, and now we see them in Algeria and Sudan and Iraq and Lebanon and other places, Jordan to a smaller extent. And it's because these Arab countries have failed in their responsibility of building durable, stable states that respond to their citizens' needs that they've opened the door for Iran to step in. And others are trying to step in now, the Russians and the Turks and other people. So the ability to create and strengthen these surrogate strategic allies is a sign of the weakness of these Arab countries. And the demonstrations that are going on clearly are bad news for Iran. In most of the countries where Iran has close ties, like Lebanon, like Syria is not still in a conflict state, but Iraq and Lebanon, where there's popular demonstrations to change the whole government system, make it more responsive, more participatory, more accountable, more successful, more humane, leaving people a life of dignity and there's millions of people out in the streets asking for this. And one of the things that they want is real sovereignty. They want to run their own countries. So the demonstrations are not explicitly against Iran, and a little bit in Iraq they were. Once in a while here you'll see somebody writing something. But implicitly, these are very problematic. The Arab uprisings are very problematic for Iran. And Soleimani was involved in Syria and in Iraq in putting down the demonstrations. And that's one reason why there's more and more resentment in some of these countries. And it's not across the board. So this is part of the complexity of this regional picture. There's so many different actors and so many apparent contradictions within countries and across countries.
Thank you very much, Rami. Now moving back to Ali. Ali, whether it's things are going towards escalation or de-escalation, what are Iran's nuclear response options?
So in my initial remarks, I spoke about the flexibility or the reversibility of the nuclear options. However, this reversibility has limits. Let me take an example of uranium enrichment. So for Iran to make nuclear fuel for its nuclear reactors, it needs enrichment of around 4%. If Iran says, okay, I want to go to 10%, I think that's still within its technical needs, because they can use 10% enrichment for research reactors and other facilities. If they go to 20%, things become much more serious. And the reason for that is, for enrichment, it's not linear. So going, for example, from 5% to 10% is almost 50% of the whole process. So going from 20% to 90%, which is the weapon-grade uranium. So if you want to create a weapon-grade uranium, you need 20% enriched. However, the energy requirement or the capacity for Iran to go from 20% to 90% is actually very easy. Okay? This is something related to the physics of enrichment processes. But anyway, so if Iran, for example, exceeds the 20%, then we are entering an irreversible nuclear response. Because then Iran becomes almost a nuclear weapon state. Clearly, of course, this is an oversimplification, because then Iran has to test this weapon, or if it produces the weapon, it has to test it, it has to provide the delivery vehicle, be it a ballistic missile or other. But in principle, in terms of the basics, Iran would be an almost weapon state country. Now, I think, again, my personal view is that Iran would like to keep its nuclear options very flexible, because they know that they are dealing with very, as Rami mentioned, very unpredictable administration in the US, and having this flexibility is actually a virtue, is something that is needed. Outside these technicalities of the nuclear program, I think the most serious step that Iran can take is to withdraw from the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And this would be a clear damage to the global international efforts to contain nuclear weapons. And then suddenly we might find ourselves in a context that is very similar to North Korea. Except, again, I borrow from Rami's comments, the complexity in the region here is way higher than the complexity in that part of the world. I think the other challenge or complex aspect of Iran's nuclear response, if Iran chooses to do that, is the regional response. So for every action, there is a reaction. And the reaction in the region is you have already 2-3 regional powers, 2 for sure. You have Saudi Arabia, you have Turkey, are interested in nuclear weapons. And are interested in nuclear weapons right now. Erdogan only last month openly said that it is unacceptable, and I'm quoting from his open remarks that you can find in the media. He said, it is unacceptable that Iran is not a nuclear weapon state. So this is not in WikiLeaks, this was said openly. The situation with Saudi Arabia, we all know it, through WikiLeaks and through also open remarks that if Iran, whatever Iran gets, we will get. So the misfortune of any miscalculated Iran action on the nuclear front might actually also trigger other action or reactions from regional power. And I think, and the third country I was referring to is Egypt, but Egypt has also a very special context. But for now, even Iran and Turkey would be enough to bother about. Now, the context, so therefore, in this context, I think the nuclear arms race has always been something that a lot of people, a lot of analysts are afraid of. But unfortunately, if we continue in this escalation, I see it a reality.
Can I ask Ali?
Yeah. Of course, please go ahead.
Ali, I'd like to ask you a question. The Iranians have always said that there was a fatwa by Khomeini not ever to make nuclear weapons, that they keep repeating. How should we take that?
That's a very good question. I think I think the best way to translate or to look at this fatwa is to be an agnostic about it and treat. I know it's very American to say, but like don't trust but verify. So I think this is not because it's Iran. I think should be the case in any nuclear country. And let me use this opportunity to say a lot of the effort a lot of people are putting against nuclear weapons focuses on Iran because Iran is always in the media. It gets a lot of attention, but there are other countries as well that have nuclear programs that are controversial as well. So the fight against nuclear weapons should be the same across all countries, not only in Iran. But my personal answer to your question is that I would focus on verification and inspections, and I would not give much attention to this fatwa.
Thank you, Rami and Ali. I will now open the floor to the audience questions. We will have a first round of, okay, so I'll start with in the back. Yes, please.
We have covered a lot the nuclear program of Iran, but I didn't hear anybody mentioning the nuclear program of Israel.
Of Israel, okay.
Is it a taboo? We're not allowed to mention that or discuss it?
Thank you very
that
much.
Israel has 200 to 300 nuclear weapons already existing. The second question, we did not cover why is United States or Israel against Iran. We did not cover that Iran is helping anti-Israeli Hamas, Hezbollah, Jihad Islami, and others with weapons. So this is not an issue that the United States is fighting Iran for.
Okay, thank you very much. I think Rami talked about strategic alliances
I just mentioned that because of the time limit, that the whole anti-Iranian approach in the last 30, 40 years has been heavily pushed by the Israelis. And recently joined by the UAE and Saudi Arabia and a couple of other hangers-on who want to get some money from the Saudis or the Emiratis. But essentially, the Israelis have been the main driving force who, as they were against Iraq and as they were against other Arab powers that emerge, and maybe one day could have been or might be against Turkey if it gets stronger. So, and the United States government, broadly speaking, has tended to go along with Israel. In the current government, we have an extreme case of completely buying into the Israeli approach and therefore going along with it. But no, we're totally free to mention it. We mention it all the time. It is a serious issue, but the world is not, apparently is not prepared to deal with it for reasons that have to do with questions beyond our...
Double standards, I mean.
It's a serious double standard, but politics is a game of double standards, unfortunately. That's the problem. So the ethics and morality have a major role in all of our lives, but have no role in the business of public politics, unfortunately. And even when there are attempts to create moral foundations, for political behavior, like the International Criminal Court or the UN Human Rights Council, the Israelis tend to be exempted from this. And to the point where even in the United States today, Israeli lobbying with extreme groups in the US are trying to prevent Americans from exercising their Second Amendment rights of free expression to criticize, say, Israel with a call to just say, I don't want to do business with Israel, like they criticized apartheid South Africa. Even that, the Israelis are opposing, and many in the government in the US, not everybody, many are going along with it. But the interesting thing there is that when it runs up against a serious process of implementing ethics enshrined in law, which is the American Constitution, when these cases get to courts in the United States, the courts always rule against what the Israelis are trying to do, that you can't prevent Americans from speaking out in peaceful ways. And so we have to look at this issue of morality and double standards in a big context, and unfortunately it tends to have very little play in the Middle East today.
Thank you, Rami. I'll take three more questions for this round. Yahya and Rayan and Munir, and maybe Marlene, we could leave it to the second round. And if you could please address your question to one of the panelists, it will make it easier. Thank you. Please start. Rayan, do you want to start? Yes.
Yeah, I have a question for Rami and another for Ahmed. For Rami, I guess it's just a general question about what the U.S. withdrawing from the nuclear agreement does to the international global system's ability to deal with such situations in the future. You know, what does this do to international law? What does this do to international negotiations? The fallout of this for, you know, the global system to deal with problems like this, like you said, in a successful way in the future. So did Trump kind of do some irreparable damage to that? Secondly, as far as Ali, I mean, well, it's not for Ali, it's actually for both of you again. Also has to do with the fact that the U.S., you know, is coming up on elections, and are we going to be able to kind of see the new administration, whether Republican or Democrat, go back to the old agreement, or this old agreement, and Ali can actually respond to this, has been also damaged in a way where they're not going to be able to they're going to have to put together a new agreement. And lastly, in addition to what my friend had mentioned here about double standards, as far as Israel having nuclear weapons, let's not forget the only country that's ever used nuclear weapons is the United States in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, killing over 200,000 civilians. People don't talk about that. That's kind of important.
Thank you, Rayan. Yahya?
Thank you. My first question is directed to Mr. Rami. So in his speech, Hassan Nasrallah said that irrespective whether the Iranians will take action or not, the axis of resistance will take an action. So do you think regarding the current situation in Lebanon, he is capable of taking such a risky action? And the second question is directed to both of you when it comes to the other players, the Chinese and the Russians. We haven't mentioned that. From cost-benefit analysis, where both are positioned? I mean, when it comes to Russia and China. Thank you.
Thank you, Yahya. Munir?
Thanks so much for your thoughts. Two quick thoughts on that. The fact that you only mentioned the role of the EU and the insects program that they have developed so briefly, does it really mean that there is that the role of the EU and this particular program is so unimportant in finding a solution to this? Second, Rami, you were mentioning the Iranians don't have any capabilities at the moment to provide better services, to think of a better public services outcome in the countries that they're influencing. Okay, fair enough, but this does not prevent them from developing an idea of how to get there. And the question that I really have in mind for you is there any way that they can actually resolve these issues with the countries in the region in the long term without developing such an idea of how to improve these relationships within the citizenry and constituencies in the countries that they're influencing? Otherwise, I think they will continue to have these challenges anyway, which they will eventually lose, no?
I just need to add to what Munir has said. It's a bit more than problems with citizens of these countries. Actually, Iran has been is being accused of crimes against humanity, or of helping dictatorships across the region, especially maybe in Syria, or accused of having malign influence in Yemen. With its special relationship with the Houthis. These actors has been committing war crimes and crimes against humanity across the region, I mean, among others, of course. So how would Iran respond to this complex relationship it has with the people, or at least with big parts of people in this region? Thank you.
You want to go first?
So there's a couple of questions that are similar, and they're all related to Iran with its dealings with its allies in the region, like Hezbollah, Hamas, all these different groups, and the Syrian government. And this is a political, strategic link that emerged after the Syrians supported Iran in the Iran-Iraq war. And the Iranians felt a debt of gratitude at one level. And at a second level, the Iranians realized early on in the 1980s and 1990s that they really had limited powers, and they needed to develop a more sophisticated defense. They see it as a defensive system, and it was the easiest way to do it was to develop these strategic allies and give them very sophisticated equipment. And therefore, the relationship with these groups, I think, is very transactional. It's very practical. It's logical from a logistical point of view. The difficulty for Iran is that this creates huge tensions within the country. So in Lebanon here, I've been in and out of Lebanon for the last 30 years, and you see how the anti-Iranian sentiment among half the population has become very big, and they openly make fun of Iran and the allies of Iran here. And this wasn't the case 20, 30 years ago, but today it's much more open. So the difficulty for Iran is overcoming this contradiction. No country wants a foreign power to have a strategic relationship with a group of its own citizens and not with the government. And this is it's more complex in Lebanon than other places because Hezbollah is in the government, it's part of the government, the parliament, the cabinet. But in its military affairs and other things, it's separate from the government. So Hezbollah, in response to your question, Nasrallah just said, we're going to continue the fight. Well, not everybody in Lebanon wants to fight Americans. Many people do, many people don't. And this is a problem all across the region. So again, the solution to this problem, solve the Arab-Israeli conflict, give the Palestinians their rights, stop Israeli colonialism, stop Israeli war crimes. And if you solve the imagine if you had solved the Arab-Israeli conflict when they attempted with the Reagan plan in 1982 or whatever it was, and before Hezbollah was born, or just as Hezbollah was born, and before Hamas was born. Imagine if you had solved the Arab-Israeli conflict and genuinely solved it so that there was no more conflict between Israelis and Arabs. We may never have had some of these problems, and also with the Israeli-Iranian relationships may not have developed. But of course, that didn't happen. So there's constantly going to be tension and contradictions and hypocrisy and double standards and immorality, all defended by every actor, whether it's Arab or Iranian or American or Israeli or Turkish. Every actor is going to say, this is self-defense. I have to defend myself. I have a right to defend myself. And it's very hard for people to challenge that. The U.S. Withdrawal from the agreement is part of a broader American Trumpian strategy to dismantle the existing global legal order in many ways, the International Criminal Court and UN agreements and the Human Rights Council and other things. So it's causing serious damage, and the problem is that nobody's picking up the ball. The Europeans are too divided. The Russians, the Chinese aren't particularly interested or don't have much credibility. So there's nobody really left to do anything, and therefore the global order is fraying, and people are getting away with a lot of terrible things. It can be restored, of course, because it's an order made by men and women. It can be remade by men and women. I don't think that, personally, I don't think Hezbollah is going to initiate any action on its own, for many reasons, which we don't have time to discuss, but I think Hezbollah is a central part of the resistance front or resistance axis, whatever it used to be called, the resistance and deterrence front. I guess now we just call it the resistance axis. The sentiments that Nasrallah expresses are very sincere. He and many Lebanese believe that. And they will take action to defend themselves in Lebanon. I'm not sure they will take action on behalf of another party, whether it's Iran or fellow Arabs and other Arab countries. I kind of doubt that, because I see Hezbollah as predominantly a Lebanese-anchored organization that is very closely linked to Iran, but I don't see it as taking action only to help Iran. But I may be wrong. We'll have to wait and see. The Europeans, the Chinese, and the Russians are essentially out for their own interest. It's fascinating that in the last 4 or 5 days you had the Russians, the Japanese, and the Chinese all indicating that they're prepared to come and do something, help out Iraq, which is really interesting. And this is a continuation of what I said at the very beginning, that the frailty of the Arab nation-state, or not nation-state, but the Arab state order that was created in 1925 or so, that order has been slowly fraying and corroding and collapsing from within some countries, not all of them. And other countries are like vultures over a dying carcass. They see an opening and they jump in. And this is what countries do. They're self-preserving, self-interested mercantile beasts. They're not philosophers of morality. Countries preserve and enhance their interests, and if they have to do it by gobbling up the remnants of other countries that are falling apart, they do it. If they have to go in and occupy somebody's land, they do it. They defend it, and sometimes the world pushes back, like when Kuwait was occupied, the world pushed back and Kuwait was liberated. But in most of the cases we see around us now, if you look at Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and Libya, much of the fighting is being done by the great Western liberal, democratic, free market, capitalist, human rights, life of dignity, world law order countries like France, England, the United States. And they're in there, fighting away with everybody else. And the Russians and the Chinese tend to hang around a little behind them, and then when they see an opening, they jump in. And now Putin is going to be working overtime in the next couple of months to, gain a foothold in places where he doesn't have one. And he's already working with the Turks in Libya. Yeah. Never mind that the Turks shot down a Soviet MiG a few years ago, but those things don't matter very much. This is just about practical self-gain and self-interest.
Let me start where you finished, Rami, on the role of other countries. Let me start with Europe, Munir. I think Europe dealing with Iran over the nuclear program has been very naive. And I say that because clearly they have overpromised and they underdelivered. And I say that, or this happened because they have underestimated the role of capital markets. They have underestimated that Europe is not one country. Europe is a group of countries that have sometimes aligned, sometimes diverging interests. When Europe's trade balance with the US is in $200-300 billion per year versus $3-4 billion with Iran, clearly it's clear where Europe would go for. And a lot of the power the US imposes over this issue is its ability to sanction not only countries but also companies, especially international companies that are, in principle, they are accountable to their shareholders and owners, not to the countries where they have originated from. And this sanctioning of companies have actually now extended beyond Europe. And this also, we see now Chinese oil companies being sanctioned recently. And this is very important, like we discussed this here, because Iran is very important for the Chinese energy security. Yes, China imports oil from Saudi Arabia, from other countries, but the Iranian oil is a sizable chunk of Chinese oil supply. So therefore, it is important for their energy policy. So China, in principle, is against restrictions or at least full restrictions on oil. But they are facing now a tough challenge. I think the next few months will show us to what extent China, and this is an open question that I share with you, the next couple of months will show us how serious China in defending its energy security interests. Russia is in a slightly similar but also different situation because in the past, Russia has been a helping hand for Iran because they have initiated an oil swap deals. So in a way, Iran could evade sanctions on oil by asking the Russians to actually, by giving the oil to the Russians, and then the Russians will repackage it because Russia, as you know, is one of the oil producers in the world, the biggest oil producers, so Russia has the capacity to repackage it as a Russian oil. Again, I'm not sure how effective would that be, given that Russia has its own interest in not losing market share in the oil market. So there's a limit to how much Russia can do this. Ryan's question, I think, is a very important one. And let me tell you this. The crisis over Iran's nuclear program, before and now, has shown the weaknesses in the global nuclear order. The NPT treaty, or the non-proliferation treaty, is flawed. It was based on very weak foundation that countries are allowed to have peaceful nuclear programs, but they are not allowed to have nuclear weapons. But guess what? Going from peaceful to weaponized is actually becoming easier and easier. It was easier before, and now with all the technological advancement, all the access of information that you can get to, it becomes even easier now. So as long as this paradigm exists, I always see that we will not solve the problem. Yesterday it was North Korea, today is Iran. We will have the same problem in the future with another country, as long as there's a political vendetta, there's a political file against it. So for me, to answer your question, it's not about the Iran deal per se, it's about the global nuclear order. It needs a lot of free thinking, but this cannot be done without some of the nuclear weapon states to take responsibility towards the aim of eliminating nuclear weapons. Not only eliminating the capabilities of aspiring countries, but also eliminating the capabilities of countries that currently have nuclear weapons.
Thank you, Ali. Third round of questions. Yes, please go ahead.
My question to Ali, it's related to the energy context as well, and security. So Trump in his speech yesterday said that he doesn't need any more of the oil in the Middle East, while he previously said in other interviews that he only wants oil from Iraq. So can we take his claims as serious, or is it only part of the many inconsistencies maybe in his policies? Thank you.
Thank you. Another question there, please.
Question for Mr. Rabi. You said that the Iranians do what they say. Don't you? The Iranians do what they say, and they say what they want to do. Don't you think that the Iranian propaganda is the most powerful for the Iranian and its allies? Since if we see the first 2-3 years in Syria, before the entry of Russia, they were losing about 70% of Syria. Sorry. And if not, and if Russia didn't interfere in the Syria's war, they were really losing. They were not winning. So don't you think that the most powerful thing for Iran is its propaganda?
Thank you. Yes, Michael, please.
Yeah, I have a question for
مارلين بعتذر منك. عفوا مايكل. Let me take. Okay, then Michael, then Marlene. Okay, thank you very much.
just for Mr. Rami about what you said before about Iranian resistance and sovereignty. So the goal of their resistance, we can say, is for independence, at least for the Iranian perspective. Because what does sovereignty actually mean? Does that mean independence for their domestic issues, or does that mean independence for their regional aspirations as well?
Thank you, Michael. Marlene, تفضل.
My first question is to Mr. Khouri, Dr. Khouri. What about the impact of the assassination? What about the impact of the assassination of General Soleimani on the effectiveness of the regional project of Iran concerning Iraq, Yemen, يعني الإكسبانسيونيزم does it affect? And my second question to Ali, how can we describe the last riposte of Iran on the American air bases in Iraq? Is it a symbolic riposte, or it's really changed the rules of engagement in the region? Thank you.
Thank you, Marlene. Any more questions? Because I think it's going to be the last round. Yes, please. You can also ask your questions in Arabic and...
Is this working? Sorry, I'm a demographer, so before, when I saw the title of this talk, I was looking at how conflicts are characterized, and one way is a state versus non-state. And I was wondering if you could discuss in the US-Iran tension the non-state actors that are important. You've mentioned resistance and you've mentioned Hezbollah, so what is the significance right now? Is it still a state conflict versus a non-state? Thanks.
Yeah. So that will be it. We will start with Ali.
Just because most of the questions are directed towards Rami, so let me finish first and then Rami can take over. Ali, thank you for your question. Indeed, I think oil markets now are vastly different than oil markets 10 or 15 years ago. Saudi Arabia is no longer the swing producer in the world. Actually, the swing producer right now is the US. So the US now is the #1 producer of oil in the world. The caveat is they are still also the #1 consumers. So they are still have some energy security considerations. Even if they produce so much oil, they are still interested in securing some of the oil that come from the outside. Because the problem with the US production, it's not unified. In the US, you have so many small companies that produce this oil, and these small companies are not coordinated. You don't have one company like Saudi Aramco that can produce 10% of the global supply under one decision making. So this complexity in oil markets, or this new paradigm that the US is a global oil producer, it lessens its dependency, but at the same time, this dependency is not completely eliminated. So having access to oil in Iraq, I think it is in the American interest, but if you look at the bigger picture, the US is moving steadily to become less and less independent on oil in the region.
Then I'll go in reverse order. The non-state actors question, they are very important only because the states in the Middle East, the Arab states, have not functioned very well. And of course, some of them are in conditions of war, like Syria or Yemen, Libya, that's an extreme case, and Iraq is still full of tensions and fighting and threats from ISIS and other places. But the real problem is that you have so many non-state actors that are militarily very powerful, that have strong support from outside their own country, and that have contradictory positions. So in Iraq, for instance, you have Muqtada Sadr's group has issued a statement saying no more, Muqtada Sadr says that Iraq will continue to, Iraqis are still allowed to fight against Americans, where other groups have said we're going to stop because the government said to stop and they're going to negotiate. And so you have mixed groups, non-state armed groups that have, they're all Iraqis and they have different positions. In Iran even, you have the government issuing a statement saying, okay, we've achieved our goals and now we're not gonna attack anymore if the Americans don't attack us. But the Revolutionary Guards commander yesterday said we're gonna keep the struggle and there's more to come. So this is really the problem. It's a free-for-all. And people can do whatever they want, and you have immense foreign intervention with the local armed actors, and that's why it's so difficult. The Iranian regional project clearly is going to suffer a little bit from the current situation, both from the assassination of Soleimani and everything it represents, and the uprisings in many Arab countries against the Arab governments for better governments. Both of those things are going to create serious challenges, I think, to the Quds Force, and they're the ones who are in charge of doing this. So we'll have to see. My guess is you'll see a lower profile. The new commander of the Quds Force is going to have probably a lower profile, and they won't be doing as much stuff in public in other Arab countries. But it depends on what happens in the Arab countries. Inside, if the Iraqis totally take control of their country and say, look, we don't want any foreign-funded militias. We don't need them. We can protect ourselves. And the same in Syria. And then you might not need the Iranians to do this. They might, because the Iranians in the final analysis want to be able to live in a condition that they're not constantly threatened or sanctioned or attacked. And if they can achieve a situation of peaceful coexistence with their neighbors and foreign powers like the Americans who are motivated by powers like the Israelis or the Saudis or others, that if they can achieve a normal modus vivendi, then there's no reason for them to fear these attacks against them or threats and whatever. And then they would not need to have these regional networks of very militarily able and motivated allies. But that's for the future, not for now. But I think they're going to adjust their regional interactions. Sovereignty is essentially an internal question. When you're sovereign, you can run your own country. Many Arab countries are independent but not sovereign. Many Arab countries are not allowed to buy military equipment unless the US Senate and the Israeli government approve it by law. There's a law in the United States that that the United States will make sure that Israel is militarily more capable than any combination of forces around it. And therefore, when smaller Arab countries, or even bigger ones like the Saudis years ago, wanted to buy refueling tanks for the F-16s or something, they had to get permission from the American Senate, which essentially has to get the okay from the Israel. So there's a partial sovereignty in situations like that. So sovereignty just means doing what you think is best for your people. So having regional networks is not a sovereign issue. It's a regional control, a regional interaction issue, whatever you want to call it. I don't know if the Iranians and the Israelis are both accused of hegemonic ambitions. The Turks sometimes are accused of this too, occasionally. And occasionally the Saudis and the Emiratis are now accused of this, that they want to be hegemons. They want to control. The word hegemon is very vague. It can mean anything you want it to mean. I don't think the Iranians want to be in control of Lebanon or Syria or Iraq. They just don't want those countries to be a threat to them. And of course, the question of Lebanon with Hezbollah is related to the fight with Israel. So they don't want the Israelis or other Americans or local people in the Gulf to threaten them. And the Iraqis attack them. So they have an experience, a bad experience. And again, I'm not supporting everything the Iranians do, but I'm just, as an analyst, my job is to try to, as a journalist and an analyst, I try to understand why people behave as they do. You have cases with people like Donald Trump who are so extreme in their behavior and so erratic that it's hard to find a pattern in Trump's behavior. But one of them is, of course, he wants to do everything different than Barack Obama did. Now, why that is, we don't know. People make accusations, and I won't repeat them, but with people in the region, you can see how they behave. If you study Hezbollah, if you study Israel, if you study Iran, if you study the Saudis and the Emiratis, there's a logic to what they do. We may not agree with it, but they follow a certain pattern of behavior that to them makes sense. And our job is to understand it, to be able to analyze it. Iranian propaganda, I think, is pretty low quality. I don't think it's very good. They just issued a statement that 80 people were killed in their attacks. Nobody in the world has verified that. And I don't know if it's true or not, but my guess is it's probably not true. But they issue statements like that, which I think propaganda, to be useful, has to be reasonably credible. It has to be based on some reality. You can exaggerate something, but you can't just make something up. So I don't agree with the idea that Iranian propaganda is effective. What's effective is the ability of the Iranians over the last 30, 40 years to play on the emotional trauma of Arab citizens who have been bludgeoned into a situation of having virtually no rights in their own countries, terrible socioeconomic situations, foreign occupations, foreign military attacks, few economic prospects, running out of water, running out of energy, running out of jobs, and across the region, Arab citizens are traumatized. 70% of Arabs are poor, 70%. And this number is rising, as we see here and other countries. The Iranians are really good at playing on that. That's what they're good at. They're good at exploiting the bad conditions in Arab countries that are a consequence of poor Arab political management and constant foreign interference, often related to the Arab-Israeli conflict, which has been going on now for a century, from Balfour to Kushner, and it's still going on. And the Israelis just yesterday, Naftali Bennett just announced that there's a big program to expand the settlements. It's unbelievable, and the Americans support this, and the Arabs can do nothing about it, partly because they're not really sovereign, and partly because they don't know how to manage their countries very well. You have groups that are good at managing things. Hezbollah is good at managing what it does. Whether you like them or you don't like them, they're very efficient. Other groups are efficient at what they do. Some corporations are efficient. Some universities are efficient. There are people in the Arab world who know how to run things well, but governments are not part of that group, as far as I can see, in most Arab countries, unfortunately. Now, that's why there's tens of millions of people out in the street, forcing them to do better governance. But the Iranians are very good at exploiting these gaps in the integrity and well-being of Arab countries. And I say that in the 100 years from Balfour to Kushner of the modern Arab century of modern Arab statehood, that most of the countries, not every single Arab country, but most of them have failed the triple tests of statehood, citizenship, and sovereignty. Statehood is troubled, as we see. Sovereignty is weak in many places, and citizenship is almost non-existent in terms of citizenship rights. And that's why you've got 70% of our people are poor, of the whole Arab region, and tens of millions are out in the streets, and they've been out in the streets demonstrating for 20 years. So that's what, and the Russians, of course, are good at this. The Chinese come in and they want to, open iron ore mines. They don't care about anything else except business. They want to get our raw materials and help us make a little money, and they make a little bit of money. The Europeans used to be much more ethically balanced, looking at our rights and looking at the rule of law and et cetera. But in recent years, as Ali said, they have succumbed to the overwhelming power of the corporate world, which really came into being with that period from 1980 to 1982, when you had Reagan and Thatcher and Helmut Kohl in Germany, you had three powerful leaders who created the current global economic order in which capital and profits are the only thing that matter. Rights and human dignity are secondary. And this is how the world has been operating, unfortunately. So when huge numbers of people suffer because of this, as we are, combined with our lack of sovereignty and rising poverty and environmental deterioration, this is the next big crisis in our lives. People like the Iranians or the Turks or the Russians or the Chinese or others will step in and exploit this. The United Arab Emirates is running around the region taking control of ports. They're renting them, but they see there's weaknesses in Eritrea or Ethiopia or Somalia. They say, well, let me run this port for you. And they take advantage. You know, a sovereign country does not lend its port out to somebody. Some of them do it just because they care about making money, but most of the time they don't. Anyway, that's a long answer to your short question.
Thank you, Rami. Thank you, Ali. Thank you very much. Thank you for the audience, and have a good evening.